So the Cold War really subsumes a lot of other things, and in the case of Japan, not only does Emperor Hirohito get off scot-free, but General MacArthur moves in and becomes sort of the dictator of Japan for a few years. And under the terms of the Marshall Plan, which offers really unlimited economic, monetary, military aid to any country which asks for it, this is meant to stop the spread of communism. We're going to rebuild the infrastructure of any nation that asks us for money because, of course, it was our fault that Hitler came around because we were isolationists, so therefore it's America's duty in the so-called American century, the post-World War era, that we are going to stop the spread of that other totalitarian ideology, communism, and we're going to do so by making sure that people are free and they're secure and they have good jobs and so forth. And, a little souvenir of this is this Japanese, I don't know if you can see this very well, this Japanese peso note. This is actually a piece of currency from the occupation of Japan where the MacArthur, there we go, maybe a little better, where the MacArthur government actually prints up these dollar bills for the currency of Japan in this process of rebuilding under American aegis. And they're actually Japanese pesos. I have no idea why the Americans chose to use a peso for it's a Mexican currency. Why we wanted to use that in Japan, but there you go. Little curiosity there. So America under the Marshall Plan is actually rebuilding the economies of Europe and of our former enemies like West Germany and Japan and so forth. And it really is economically beneficial for America because we have no competition. The economies of Europe and the East are wrecked, and so we can get them to buy all our stuff, basically. And it's going to come back to haunt us in the 1970s when these countries actually do recover and start to compete with us, and it tanks the whole economy in the world in the 70s and really leads to this post-industrial economy today, but more about that later. For the case of Europe, of course, they're out of it. Europe can't afford to do this anymore. As a matter of fact, the reason why that America gets involved in Greece anyways, because in 1947 the British simply went to President Truman and said, look, we can't prop up this Greek dictatorship anymore. We can't afford it. 1947 is also the same year that England loses India because of the Indian independence movement there under Mohandas Gandhi and Nehru and others. It's simply too strong, and the British can't fight it, don't really have the heart to fight it anymore. They're exhausted. They're faced, of course, with all these sorts of ideas, like one on your study guide, ahimsa, which is actually the nonviolence protest that the Indians under Gandhi had used. Ahimsa is nonviolent protest. There's also, of course, the growth of black nationalism in Africa. The mandate system is breaking down that the Europeans had used to rule the Middle East. So clearly the Europeans are just losing their grip here. 1948, Burma and Sri Lanka, the former British colonies, are given their independence. 1954, wow, that's a fateful date. France loses control of Indochina. That brings America into the Vietnam conflict because something sort of fateful happens there, which we'll talk about. Really, Indochina in 1954 and Korea in 1950 are very similar conflicts in that both of these countries had been fighting against their own colonial masters, in France primarily in these cases. Then when the French were defeated by the Germans and the Japanese came in and took over these colonies, then these guerrilla movements, these anti-colonial freedom fighters, if you like, had fought against the Japanese. And then when the war was over and everybody was saying, oh, we're going to have peace and freedom, America was talking about democracy and self-determination and all that stuff. We take the Japanese surrender and then hand these places back over to France again. So these movements in Korea, in Vietnam, and Indochina just fought against the French like they had before. And finally, when the French have to pull out because they're broke and unwilling and unable to fight anymore, the Americans step into these places. So under the aegis of the Cold War, we become, in a sense, without meaning to, sort of colonialist powers. And it's perfectly a Cold War policy. It's to contain communism. Now, to understand containment, you have to understand that now we have nuclear weapons. In 1948, the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. You cannot fight conventional world wars anymore. So containment means that, for example, in Korea in 1950, in Vietnam in 1954 to 1975, very long commitment there, our objective is not to defeat the communists there. No. Our objective is to enforce the divide between communist North Korea and non-communist South Korea, between communist North Vietnam and non-communist South Vietnam. The effort is not to defeat the communists. No American had the objective of invading North Korea or North Vietnam and defeating the communists there and killing them all off. No, this is containment, where we want to contain communism where it is and stop it from spreading. That is the primary objective here. Now, it undergoes some alterations in history, but basically that is the attempt right there. So for the British, their sort of final withdrawal from imperialism comes in 1956 when they lose control of the Suez Canal in Egypt. So in all these places and many others, America does not want to leave these places open for possible communist expansion, so America commits troops to these places instead. Now, it doesn't matter to a lot of people there who is invading or occupying or for what purpose. A lot of people in these places don't see the difference between the democratic capitalist or the old-style imperialist. To them, it's still imperialism. So another one of these terms on the study guide is decolonization and anti-imperialism and human rights. Human rights becomes one of the reasons why people in Latin America or Africa or the Middle East will start to protest this occupation by America or the English or even the Soviets or whoever, because it's infringing on our human rights. Eventually, of course, we will see the creation of the non-aligned movement, because in this post-war world, in this Cold War world, for most people, you have two choices. You can do it the Soviet way or the American way. You can get money from the Soviets or from the Americans, and you really can't go it on your own. You have to be a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which is the organization, the self-defense organization led by America, which is non-communist, anti-communist actually. Or you can join or seek protection from the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet and communist version. This treaty of protection, this mutual treaty of protection of each other. So the world is clearly lined up on one side or the other. The non-alignment movement will try to say we want to go our own way and we don't want to be on either side, but that's a difficult thing to do up until the 1960s and 70s as the Cold War starts to barely wind down. As far as Eastern Europe goes, a lot of people in America see these as merely satellite states under the domination of the Soviets, but that's not actually quite accurate, because the Soviets and the Americans, the British and the French, had actually agreed to some extent on what they were going to do after the war, at least when it comes to Europe. New nations were created, like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, of course, under some amount of Soviet control, but not absolute control, because these nations had within them plenty of communists who wanted to ally with the Soviets. And in addition, you have to understand that Stalin, in many cases, now we know, now that the Cold War is over, had trouble with trying to harness these nations, keep them under control. For example, the East Germans were notorious. The Soviet zone of occupation included East Germany, and the East Germans were agitating for their own communist state, and Stalin was basically telling these people, no, look, you have to work within this alliance here. You have to join these pro-democracy parties and work for democracy and go through elections. And the German communists were saying, no, we're not going to do that. Over in West Germany, they've got Nazis in place in leadership. We don't want to fool with these people. We want to, we suffered as much or more than anybody under Hitler, so we want a communist state. But Stalin was trying to put the brakes on this movement. Actually, it was all kind of taken out of his hands, because the denazification that was supposed to be done, there was this plan among all the Western allies that Germany would be deindustrialized, and the industrial infrastructure of Germany would be actually packed up and moved off, and Germany would be reduced to some kind of backwards village or something, completely dependent on the Allies. The Soviets started doing this, but the Allies didn't, and used this as a propaganda ploy and said, hey, look at that brutal Stalin, how he's looting Germany, Eastern Germany. And Stalin said, what? I thought we agreed on this. And then the Western Allies take things out of Stalin's hands and announce the creation in 1948 of a Western Germany, of a Federal Republic of West Germany, not including Eastern Germany. So really Stalin has no choice but to allow the East Germans to declare their own communist state. So this is a very, very complicated set of questions here in history, as we'll see in the next part of this lecture.